Introduce our speaker. We are very, very blessed to have Charles Hall here speak. He's a CPA. He does a tremendous amount of auditing. He became a CPA in 1987, a certified fraud examiner in 2004. He's very well known in the Southeast. He's a national known expert, and he has an international blog, and his expertise is really on fraud and crime prevention within businesses and nonprofits and local governments. Here's his book if you want to see. So he's written this book, and he's going to talk a little bit more about that. So if you want some good reading, that'll be great. But with that said, here you go, Charles.
Thank you, Dan. Okay, guys, I'm here to teach you how to steal. You might find that really strange that a CPA, somebody that works with governments, would actually come and teach you how to steal. Now, why would I do this? Well, for many years, I've taught fraud prevention, and as I've taught people how fraud occurs, people in my audiences would say to me, "Hey, you're just teaching us how to steal." And I thought, well, why don't I just go all in and really teach people how to steal? Seriously, what I want to do today is teach you how to prevent theft, but I'm going to teach you how to prevent it by seeing how it happens. You can't stop something that you really don't understand. So I want you to understand the psychology of a fraudster. You know, how do people think? What makes them tick? What causes them to steal money? So we're going to look at the psychology. We're also going to look at the actual schemes that people use to steal money. Now, if I'm going to teach you how to steal, I need to give you a good mentor to follow. So we're going to start with the queen of all thieves, a lady named Rita Crunwell, and some of you may have heard of Rita before. She was a city comptroller in Dixon, Illinois, and about 5 years ago, they discovered she had been on the take pretty seriously. Now, Rita, at the time, she was 58 years old. Her salary was about $80,000 a year, and she had been working with the city of Dixon about 20 years. So along the way, she came up with a way to start stealing money. Now, over the 20-year period, she was actually able to steal $53 million. You heard that right, $53 million. And she lived in Dixon, and Dixon's about the size of Cordele, Georgia. Now, you may be thinking, how in the world does somebody steal $53 million from a city that's the size of Cordele, Georgia? Well, you do a little over a long period of time, and that's what she did. So she was able to set up an extra bank account. She was the city comptroller, so the bankers in the community knew her, and she just simply walked in, said to the bank, "Hey, I'd like to open another bank account in the name of the city," and she was the sole signature authority on the signature card. And so she opens up this extra bank account that nobody at the city knew about. And then she began writing checks out of the Capital Projects Fund into this extra bank account. Now, bear in mind, this secret account was never set up on the general ledger. So none of the deposits or disbursements from this account ever appeared on the city's records. Now, that initial capital outlay disbursement, that showed up in the records, but the activity over here in the secret account never showed up. Rita, over time, bought 400 quarter horses. And now, I don't know about you, but from what I understand, if you own just one or two horses, that cost a lot of money. She had 400 quarter horses. 8 years in a row, she was the breeder of the year in the quarter horse community. She was well known throughout the world for her work with horses. Now, she had 2 horse ranches, one in Illinois, one down in Florida. She also had a $2.1 million motor coach. So you can imagine Rita getting in her motor coach. She turns on George Strait. She's riding down the road, and she's enjoying life really big at the expense of the taxpayers there in Dixon. She also spent $300,000 on jewelry. So she looked nice as she went to her horse events. So, you know, you're probably wondering, well, how did she get away with this over this long period of time? And the short answer is she was in control of everything. She reconciled the bank statements. She entered all the transactions in the general ledger. She provided the reports to mayor and council. She did everything. So this city lacked what we call segregation of duties. And of course, as you know, segregation of duties is when you have multiple people involved in an accounting process. And the reason you want to do that is so you have multiple eyes on the money. So in this situation, Rita was the sole set of eyes on what was going on. Now, when I talk about this theft, people always want to know what? How did she get caught? Well, that's kind of amusing. You know, if you can laugh at something like this, I guess you have to laugh to keep from crying about this. But Rita took a 4-month sabbatical to go to horse shows. And while she's away, she had a substitute named Mrs. Swan. And Mrs. Swan one day was doing the accounting and she needed all of the bank statements. So she called the local bank and she said, hey, I need a copy of every bank statement. And so she received every bank statement. That secret account that we were talking about, she got that one as well. Before that day, nobody in the city other than Rita knew that account existed. When she got this extra special bank statement, she started looking at the checks that cleared the statement. And they were really strange. They were for things like horses, horse feed, horse trailers, typical ranching type activities. So she goes to the mayor and she says to the mayor, do you know what this is? And the bank account said City of Dixon, Illinois, Reserve Sewer Deposit Account. Now, the Reserve Sewer Deposit Account, she used an appropriate name because the money was going down the drain. And so they were losing this money to this secret account. And when the mayor looked at the cleared checks, you can imagine his thoughts. He had known Rita for 25 years, and so he trusted her. And we're going to talk more about trust in a minute. Sometimes we trust people too much. And in this case, the mayor had trusted Rita too much, and the council members had trusted Rita too much. So she was able to get away in a grand scale. She was able to steal $53 million. Now, the good thing is the city sued the auditors and the bank, and they were able to get back $40 million of the 53 that was missing. And then the U.S. Marshal Service was able to sell the ranch and horses and get $10 million back. There were $10 million in attorney's fees, so they ended up with about $40 million. So all of a sudden, the city that had no money had $40 million. I joke with my audiences and say this is a great way to build your fund balance. I wouldn't recommend it, but that's what happened in this case. So if you want a good role model to follow in stealing, Rita Crunwell would be an excellent model. That was the largest municipal fraud in U.S. history. And again, from a city about the size of of Cordell, Georgia. So let's begin the presentation, and I'm going to give you 6 points in how to steal money. And again, I'm trying to teach you how to think like a fraudster so you can stop theft in your counties and cities. And by the way, before I get into this, Dan and I were talking before I started, and he handed me this summary of ACCG claims, and I thought I might read just 2 or 3 of these to you to kind of give you an idea of what really happens in the state of Georgia. So here's a theft by a county clerk of court, $219,000. Let's see what else we got here. We have a tax commissioner taking money. That was just $1,400, but still, you don't want that either. Here's another clerk of court office at $54,000. Here's a county computer person stole $59,000. Here's a tax commissioner, $100,000. Here's a probation officer, $39,000. So let me tell you, fraud and theft is still alive in the state of Georgia. I'm sad to say, but it does happen.
And I know within GMA's had a claim, one I think of $900,000 and one of over 500, another one over $500,000.
900,000. And yeah, as Dan and I were talking before I got started, I want you to think for a moment, this Monday morning, let's suppose you get out of bed, you fix a cup of coffee, you get your local paper, you sit down, and on the front page of the paper, they say theft in your county or your city. Even if it's a small amount, it's not a place you want to be. So what I want to try to do in the short period of time we have today is to try to teach you how a thief thinks so we can prevent that occurrence in your life. I know you'd be glad to never have that kind of morning. So 6 points: be believable, have a cause, develop your plan, calm your conscience, execute your plan, and then 6, if you get caught, settle out of court. So let's start with number 1, be believable. Some of you might know who this gentleman is. Usually when I've got a live audience, I'll ask, do you know who this guy is? And I bet I can see some of you shaking your head, yes, I know who this guy is. This is Frank Abagnale. He's the guy in Catch Me If You Can, the movie. So before he was 19 years of age, he was able to get a Pan Am uniform. He was able to get IDs that allowed him to look like a pilot. And he manufactured these IDs, but he looks like a pilot to me. And because he looked like a pilot and people believed he was a pilot, he was able to do something called deadheading. Now, deadheading is when a pilot gets on a competitor's airplane, goes and sits in the cockpit of the plane and catches a free ride to another city. Because he had the uniform and he looked like a pilot and he had the IDs, everybody thought he was for real. And he was able to fly 250 times free. He traveled over a million miles free. He cashed hundreds of thousands of dollars of fake checks. And at one point, He's actually in the cockpit. The pilot gets up and says, "Have a seat." And the pilot, the real pilot says to Frank, "Fly this bird." And so he sits down and reaches over and turns on automatic pilot. Now think about that the next time you fly. So he did this with 140 people on the plane, although he said, "I couldn't even fly a kite." If you can get people to believe you're something you're not, that you're honest, though you're not honest, then you can achieve big things in terms of stealing money. Now, he was able to do this before he was 19. So trust is the currency of fraud. If you can get people to trust you, to believe in you, then you can rise in your position. You can have greater opportunity as you elevate in your positions in a city or county. Then you have more latitude to steal. You also become more knowledgeable about how everything works, and because of that, you're in a better place where you can steal. But you know what? You're in luck. You already look trustworthy, even though I can't see you. I've worked with a lot of people like yourselves through the years. I've been doing county and city audits since 1986, so I know what kind of people my audience is in my audience today. So you already look trustworthy. People like you look trustworthy. So what does a typical fraudster look like? Well, he looks like me. So if you read the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners survey, most people who steal, they're usually in about the 30 to 45 years of age group. Now, I'm older than that. I'm 60 now. In this picture, I'm much younger, got less gray. But, you know, people who steal, they look like I do. And so you're already in a place where you probably look trustworthy. So number two, have a cause. Now, this gets to the issue of incentive. And we talk about in fraud prevention, rationalization. We'll talk about that in a little bit, incentive and opportunity. And at the moment, we're going to talk about incentive. So let's have a cause. If you're going to steal, you need a reason to steal. People who steal quite often have what's called a compelling, unshareable need. Now, this is some deep, dark sin that we don't want anybody else to know about. Only we know about it, and we hide it, and we continue with this activity, and it incentivizes us to steal. Stuff like a gambling habit. So people might go to Biloxi, or they might go to Vegas or different places and gamble, and that becomes an addiction for some people, and that would lead some to steal. Another one is drug use. And I was telling Dan earlier, the first fraud case I ran into was almost 25 years ago, and it was a tax commissioner here in Georgia. And as I was doing the audit, I hear a little knock on the door, and the gentleman pokes his head in the door and he says, "Can I come in?" I said, "Yeah, come on in." And he sits down and he begins to tell me that the tax commissioner had a cocaine habit. And then he says, and of course he's saying to me, "I'm telling you this confidentially, please don't tell anybody else." And I won't tell you the county's name, by the way. But he tells me that this tax commissioner, now think about this, a tax commissioner in Georgia has a cocaine habit. And not only that, she was inviting people to her house and they were having cocaine parties, is what the gentleman told me. Now, I never went to any of the parties to verify, so I can't promise you this was actually true, but this is what I was told. I do know that she was able to steal $850,000 over about a 3-year period before we were finally able to get the FBI in. The FBI brought the Internal Revenue Service in, who prosecuted her on a tax evasion statute. She was stealing all this cash, actually taking it to the bank and depositing that and not reporting on her tax returns. She did go to prison, by the way. But she had a compelling, unshareable need. She had a drug habit. And this is the one that I see the most today. It's not a drug habit, it's not gambling. More and more I see people stealing simply to have things that they can't afford. They want to keep up with the Joneses. They want a bigger house. They want a Range Rover. They want a really nice Cadillac or whatever, you know, so they steal in order to keep up with the Joneses. And then another one that's happening more over time is the issue of medical bills. My son has cystic fibrosis. And so would Charles Hall steal to keep his son alive? I want to say no, but if I actually got in that situation, it's hard to say that I wouldn't do it. I don't think I would. But for people in a lot of stress financially, sometimes they don't want to go tell everybody I can't afford to pay my medical bills. They begin to steal. Now, we need to develop our plan so we're believable and we have a cause. And number 3, we're going to develop our plan. So how do we develop a plan? Well, one way is to look for places where there's a lack of segregation of duties. Now, your auditors have probably said to you from time to time, we lack segregation of duties in a certain part of the county or city. And quite honestly, this happens more in constitutional officers' situations than most anywhere, because in some of those offices, there might be just 2 or 3 people. In a county commissioner's office, there's usually more people there, so you're able to spread those duties out. Now, I'm not saying to you just because of say, a sheriff's office or a probate court office lacks segregation of duties that theft is definitely going to occur. But it is an environment where it's more likely to occur. Okay, so I don't know why my clicker's.
That's me.
All right, okay, there we go. All right, your auditors will also tell you where you can steal. Now, you may be laughing and thinking, well, I've never had my auditor tell me where to steal. If you have internal control problems, you should be getting what's called a SAS 115 letter from your auditors. It tells you what your significant deficiencies are in your internal controls and also where the material weaknesses are. Those are places where fraud can occur. So if you were looking for an idea about how to steal, that would be a place to look. Now, what we should be doing when we get those letters is to remediate the weaknesses and close that door so that theft cannot occur. And then just look for places where people aren't paying attention. At this point, I always think about landfills. Where are landfills? Where they're way out on the border of the county, right next to the neighbor that you least like. But money is coming into those landfill offices, and maybe nobody's really paying close attention to what's going on there. So places like that, where there's not a lot of people there, not a lot of people involved, those are greater opportunities for theft. So here's some ideas, ways that you can get what's coming to you, and that's the way the fraudster thinks. I should be getting more money. Well, if you want to steal, work for a government that doesn't have a hotline. in the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners survey, and they do a survey every 2 years, they found that 45% of the frauds were detected through a hotline. Now, very briefly, I'll just tell you that a hotline is a vehicle for your people in your county or your city to communicate the potential for theft. They may see things that you need to be aware of. If they don't have a way to communicate what they're seeing, then they may not. But if you will create an avenue for them to communicate, then they're more likely to do this. If possible, you want this to be an anonymous means of communication. And there are companies that will do this for you, 24/7. There's a fee involved, but they'll do this, and your employees can call and say, hey, I saw my fellow employee come up in a red Maserati today, and he makes $35,000 a year. That looks fishy to me. Then these companies will accumulate that information and then route it to a designated person in your county or city. So it just gives your people a way to communicate. If you're in a small city, I know I heard Sandra Lee a minute ago over in Dallas. If you wanted something that wasn't as sophisticated as a 24/7 deal where you're paying a lot of money, you could just simply say, look, if you suspect fraud, then you need to communicate that to Sandra or to the attorney for the government. So just give them a way that they can communicate potential risk areas. One of the biggest ways that people steal money in governments is through bribes. And, we read about elected officials being bribed, but I want you to think at the county and city level about people with the power to purchase. I'm going to say that again, people with the power to purchase. Maybe you have a purchasing officer. Maybe you have department heads that have the power to make the decision to buy. Those people can be bribed by vendors, and you can have some really nasty situations. I actually saw one where, and this is not in a county or city, but this actually happened in a hospital. They were building a new hospital, and the bribe was a free house. A free house. So the chief executive officer of the hospital got a free house because he gave the contract to a certain construction company. And all that construction company did is they included the cost of that free house and turned around and upped their invoice to the hospital, and the hospital actually paid for that house. They just didn't know it for a while. So bribery is quite common because, if you're an elected official and somebody walks up to you and says, here's $100,000 in cash, if you'll just give me this contract, that's pretty tempting. And then the vendor, again, they're just going to inflate their invoices back to the city or county, and they're going to get that money back. They're just going to get it from the taxpayer. 47% of frauds are corruption related. In other words, they're usually bribes, kickbacks, gratuities, those types of things. So why do people use kickbacks? Because they're hard to detect. I'm a professional in this area, and I can tell you, even for me, this is really hard to detect. So the hotline, it becomes even more important. There's no conversion problem. You see, if I steal, say, a tractor from your county government, I got to convert it. I'm going to sell it. I got to sell it and convert it to cash. If I get a bribe, I just get cash. There's no conversion problem. And then finally, the fraudster sometimes thinks that a kickback doesn't hurt anybody. Well, it really does. It hurts the taxpayer. Another way to steal, and this is one that really scares me in counties and cities, is what's called a fictitious vendor scheme. So suppose for a minute I work in your government, I'm the accounts payable clerk. I set up a new vendor, a fictitious vendor, one that doesn't exist, and I call it ABC Company. And then I create some fake invoices and I submit those invoices, and I can process the checks. And in my situation, these checks are signed by the computer. And by the way, when I set up ABC Company, the mailing address is 100 Derby Lane, Macon, Georgia, 31210, which is my home address. And so then those checks get mailed to me. I simply go to a local bank. I open up a bank account in the name of ABC Company. I deposit those checks and I start having fun. This is a threat in every government in the country, and I can promise you it happens in a very common fashion. So here's some hot button places where fraud is occurring. If you were looking for ideas to steal the kickbacks, the non-cash area. A lot of people steal equipment or vehicles. I've even seen train cars stolen. I've seen jet parts stolen. You wouldn't believe some of the things that people will steal and then try to sell it on eBay. Other areas, a billing scheme, we talked about fictitious vendor scheme. That's a type of billing scheme. And then some people just steal the cash on hand. Now it's time to calm your conscience. I grew up in a little town down in southwest Georgia called Donaldsonville, Georgia. When I was a little boy, I had a little green bicycle. And I remember getting on my green bicycle and driving it down and going to the Piggly Wiggly. Some of you folks will remember Piggly Wiggly's, but there was a grocery store there. I go in the grocery store, I've got a coat on, it's kind of cold that day, and I'm 8 or 9 years old. I'm standing at this magazine rack in the grocery store, and I see this magazine, and I'm thinking, I want that magazine. But I had no money. So I looked to my left, I looked to my right, nobody's looking. I grab the magazine, I put it in my coat, I go out, get on my little green bicycle, and I'm driving down to 506 South Dowling Avenue where I live. But the problem is I started hearing this voice, so to speak, and it was saying, "Charles, what are you doing?" And I kept hearing it, so I turned around and went back to the grocery store, stood at the magazine rack. I looked to the left, I looked to the right, I pulled that magazine, I put it back in the stand, and I went home. Now, people who steal, they have to calm their conscience. They have to get that voice to be quiet. And one of the ways they do it, and Van was saying this to me earlier, people start by stealing a little bit of money, and sometimes they say to themselves, I'm not stealing, I'm borrowing. And so they'll borrow $500. And I've seen this. People will borrow $500. They'll actually put it back. They'll borrow $500 again. They'll put it back. They'll borrow $1,000. They'll put back $600. They'll borrow $2,000, they'll put back $300. They'll borrow $5,000, they don't put back. And so over time, they're borrowing and they realize nobody's seeing what's going on, and then it gets out of hand. Some people will say to themselves, you know what? I've worked for this city or this county for 20 years. I've gotten 1% a year as a raise. This county or city owes me a lot of money, so I'm going to take what is mine. And so we're doing this rationalization thing where we're trying to make ourselves believe that this is equitable, that it is fair. But above all, you've got to overcome your conscience. But if you don't have a conscience, just skip this step. And this is where, if I have an audience, people are usually laughing. Feel free to go ahead and laugh, even if you're by yourself.
Is anyone laughing out there? Anyone want to share their laugh?
So, you know, some people have done what I call searing their conscience. In other words, they've done things wrong so long, they no longer have a conscience, and so they're able to do this. Okay, now it's time to execute your plan. So we're getting down to the nitty gritty, and we're about to pull the trigger on the plan. Now, I'm going to pause just for a second. If you do have any questions, feel free to shoot those in, and Dan will let me know what those are, and I'll be glad to try to respond to those. If not, if it pops up, I'll stop and respond to those.
I'm just gonna, let me just talk to a couple people, see if they have any questions while we're here.
Good.
Russ Madison, are you out there? Russ Madison. Are you there? I guess that's a no. Paula Chamberlain, are you out there? She is, but I don't think she can talk, so I'm good with that. One more person, we'll see if we can get anybody. Here, Mia Sharpton, are you out there? Mia.
Hey, I'm here.
So you have a question?
I do. I was starting to type it, but I'll go ahead and ask it. Have you ever seen an instance where there were dual signatures on checks in place, but the fraud is still happening?
Yes, I have. And let me explain how that happened. What was going on is the city had a signature stamp. And I'll go ahead and say to everybody in the audience, if you have signature stamps, go to your window right now. Well, go dig a hole about 10 foot deep and cover it up. This is, you know, when we have signature stamps, they are convenient, but it just opens the door to theft. So in this city, there's a signature stamp, and then the other lady is actually a finance director. She was the other signature, and so what she would do is write checks to herself manually, stamp the check with the mayor's signature, and then write her signature. And then when she made the entry in the general ledger, she would code it to like supplies, even though it was a check to herself. And by the way, this lady was extremely influential in her community, very well respected from a family that had money in the community. And so everybody was shocked. So yes, I have seen that happen.
Any additional questions, Mia?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Not right now.
Excellent.
Thank you, Mia.
Very good. That was a great question. Go ahead.
Okay, so now it's time to execute your plan. Now, as you do so, what you want to do is you want to start small. Now, we said earlier when you were in the borrowing example, we're going to borrow a little money. That's a good example. So a lot of people who steal, they start real small. Now, why would they do that? They are testing the water. So if you ever go swimming down at the lake and maybe it's been a little cool and you put your toe in there and you're just trying to check it out, well, they're testing the water basically to see whether or not anybody's paying attention. So you start small and you're doing this in increments and you're really flying under the radar. So as you do this, you keep doing it over time, and you think of Rita Crunwell, she started out kind of small, but over time it became really large. She was able to steal $5 million in 1 year. And I didn't tell you earlier, the budget for the city of Dixon, Illinois was $8 to $10 million a year. She was able to steal $5 million in 1 year. Now that's not small, but she started out small, and then over 20 years it got out of hand because nobody was paying attention. And again, there was no segregation of duties. So if you're going to steal, and I'm still joking with you about doing that, I hope none of you will steal, because you might get a visit from me one day, and I don't want to do that. I want to protect you, by the way. I like to help governments prevent fraud. I don't like to detect fraud. I like to prevent it. And that's part of what I do, by the way. I help governments prevent theft. And so now, if you've stolen some money, well, we won't use that ugly word stolen. We'll use that word borrowed. If you borrowed some money for a while, and then you stop and you begin to listen, do I hear any sirens? Is anybody coming in to put handcuffs on me? If you're not hearing or seeing any signals that you've been discovered, well, now it's time to go for the gusto. The coast is clear, put the hammer down and go big. And if you do, if you go really big, then you'll probably get caught over time. And then if you get caught, then you want to settle out of court. Now, why would you, as a fraudster, want to settle out of court? Well, you know what's funny to me about people who steal is there are some people who have the audacity to be what I call a serial fraudster, a serial fraudster. And this is somebody that steals from one government. The government, discovers the theft. They don't prosecute the person because, maybe we go to church with that person, or we've known them a long time, or, whatever. So they're not prosecuted. They never go to jail. They have no criminal history. They leave that city or county. They move maybe to another state, and they go to work for another city or county. And when the new city or county does a background check, there's no history of them being a criminal. So they get rehired, and what happens? They steal again. So if you get caught, you want to settle out of court. You don't want the criminal history. And what some fraudsters would be bold enough to say would be this: oh, you don't want the embarrassment for your county to prosecute me, and that's in the paper. So let's keep this quiet. Even if you're prosecuted and you go to jail, a lot of times you're only there for white collar crime for 3 to 5 years, and then you're out. And if there's no criminal, well, you'd have a criminal record at that point. But so if you're caught, you go to jail, you're a good prisoner, you're out in 2 to 5 years, and you rock on. Now, Rita Crunwell, by the way, got 19 and a half years. She's 58 years old when she went to prison, so she'll be there probably till death. And I don't wish that for her, but she's in prison today, right now, looking out the bars. Okay, now that you have a fraudster's point of view, I'm going to talk about some finer points about, and we're going to shift gears here. I've been telling you how to steal, how a fraudster thinks. I want to shift gears, and we're going to put the white hat on now and talk about how you can prevent theft from occurring. One of the things that you want to do is sometimes when I'm doing a presentation and I make this point, I actually stand up in a chair and start waving because this is the most important point. Make sure you have enough insurance. So get with your insurance dealer, broker, representative, and make sure you got enough fidelity insurance to cover theft at a decent level. Now, why do I say this to you? Because my experience with people who steal is they spend it faster than they take it. So if we feel like, okay, well, if they steal from us, we'll just go retrieve that money after we discover them, it won't happen. This is how you get your money back, is back through an insurance policy. So make sure you've got enough insurance to cover potential theft. My second point here is those you trust most can hurt you most. Now, I bet many of you are like me. You were raised in a family where your mother and your father, they taught you to trust other people. And I want you to trust other people, but I also want you to verify what they're doing. As Dan said to me before we started, you trust, but verify. An old phrase from Ronald Reagan, trust, but verify. So you trust the people around you, but you also verify what they're doing. Another thing here is the higher somebody's position is, the more damage they can do to a county or city government. So people say in a finance director's role or a tax commissioner's role, they can steal a lot of money because of the level they work. There's a lot of opportunity there. So just be mindful as you look around your county or city, the people that are highly elevated, they can do more damage. Another point, trust your mother, but cut the decks. Just another way of saying, trust people, but pay attention and do the things you need to do to prevent theft from occurring. Now, one of the things that you can do to keep theft from occurring is to do surprise checks in your county or city. And I've done this for some other governments. So what does that look like? Well, when I've done this, I have full latitude to pull up to a county courthouse or city hall. I walk in, they know, everybody there knows that the city or county's contracted with me to do surprise checks. And I come in and I might just say on that day, okay, we're going to take a look at the payroll. We're going to see what's going on in payroll. We're going to make sure that terminated employees have been removed from the payroll system. Now, why is that important? Well, because let's say John Doe works at the county, he's terminated. Let's say I'm the county finance director, or I'm the payroll clerk, and I have the ability to leave John Doe in the payroll. Well, I leave John in the payroll even though he's moved out of state. That check is, or that direct deposit that used to go to John, is now going to come to me because I'm going to go in the payroll system and change John's bank account number to my bank account number. So now I'm getting my payroll check, I'm getting John's payroll check, so I'm getting paid twice every time. I saw this happen in Middle Georgia just 2 years ago. It cost the company right at $1 million. And it's just simply somebody leaving, the payroll clerk leaving, terminated people on payroll, changing their bank account number to their bank account number. The lady who was doing this was actually getting 7, 8, 9 payroll checks every payroll. So you want to
Is that the best way to do it? Is to have an outside auditor come in and periodically look at those things?
Well, the key here, Dan, is you want to make sure you got somebody that understands what can happen. If you got somebody inside that really understands the dynamics, then by all means use that person on the inside. If you don't have somebody that's fully knowledgeable in internal controls and how fraud happens, it may not work. But I do want to say this, and by the way, whether you ever do business with me, I'm good with it. I want to help you today. Whether you use somebody like me or you use somebody inside, you can do a lot of things that will greatly decrease the threat of fraud. And Dan held my book up earlier. You can go out on the internet and get this off of Amazon. I think it's $15.99. Go to the very back, and in the very back, in the appendices, you'll see things that you can do all by yourself, even if you're a city of 1,000 people. Things that you can do that are really proactive, that aren't really hard to do. So, for example, you might have, say you're in the Iron City, Georgia, which is down in southwest Georgia where I'm from. In Iron City, they don't have the money to hire somebody like me, but they do have a mayor, and they can have the mayor once or twice a year get the bank statements, open the bank statements, and scan all of the cleared checks. And the mayor would tell the people in the city, I'm going to do this twice a year. So simple things like that you can do in any size government to protect yourself. Along, this same idea, well, another idea that comports with what I just said is maybe have a copy of the bank statement, not only go to the finance director, but have a copy of the bank statement go to a second person that's not in accounting. That second person opens that bank statement, scans the activity every month. That's easy. Or just have the bank statement sent to that other person first. They open it, they review it, and then they send it to accounting. Real simple little things like that can greatly decrease the threat of theft in your government.
Do you see in your history, do you see any conspiracy where there might be two people involved?
Oh, yes. Yes. So Dan asked, do we ever see two or more people working together? What's interesting, Dan, is the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners survey. The median theft when one person's involved is $40,000. The median theft when two or more are involved is $240,000. So when there is what we call collusion, when there's two or more people involved, it can get real expensive. I think of a school system in Northwest Georgia. I won't call them by name, but they just had $6 million stolen, and there were 17 people allegedly involved in this theft. 17 people working together to steal money from kids, in effect. So it can get really interesting. All right, so know your system weaknesses. Now, this point is one that you really would need a professional to come in and look at things. When I was a kid, I'd get my Sunday newspaper and I'd do the connect the dots thing, and it turns into a rabbit. Somebody that really understands internal controls, they know how to connect the dots in an accounting system so that it's fully understood what the risks are. Somebody that can do that, you probably would then be using a CPA or certified fraud examiner outside of your government. And I think I'm blocked again, Dan. Okay. All right, and then finally, develop a fraud prevention program. So you want to monitor what's going on. You develop a program to prevent fraud. And again, many of the things that you could do, they're right in the back of this book. I've got a checklist like for payroll, for payables, for cash, revenues, receipts, etc. And, you know, for just a little bit of money, you can get those ideas without even calling somebody like me.
So a question has popped up, and you probably can't answer this, but the question is, how much insurance does standard ACCG liability policy provide for this threat? So if anybody from ACCG, Ashley, if you're listening, if you could type me an answer, I'll let everybody know.
Okay, good. I think I'm blocked again.
Yeah, you are.
Okay. Okay. And then finally, just pay attention to signs. So I'm going to end with a short story, and feel free to type in any other questions as I tell this story. So 20 years ago, I'm 41 years of age. I'm driving down Houston Lake Boulevard in Warner Robins, Georgia, and I look at my wife and I say, "Am I driving straight?" And she says, "Are you driving straight? What are you talking about?" I said, "I feel like I'm drunk, like I can't drive straight." She said, "I don't know what you're talking about, but you're driving straight." Well, after that, I started having dizzy spells. Sometimes I'd go to walk out a door and I'd run into the door frame. One day I got up to walk out of a theater and I just fell down in the floor. So I'm 41 years of age. I have 2 kids that are like 3 and 5 years of age. I'm married, and I'm like, something is wrong with me. I would close my eyes and touch my face with my finger, and I could not feel the touch of my finger on my face. I'm going to doctors. I go to 3 different ENTs. Nobody can tell me what's wrong with me, which was quite frustrating. So one night I'm at home and I'm on the internet and I'm surfing a health website, and I see the words acoustic neuroma. And I go, I don't know what that is. That's a big word for a South Georgia guy. So I click the link. I start reading the symptoms of an acoustic neuroma, which is a brain tumor. And I look at my wife and I say, this is what I have. So the next day I take this printout, give it to my ENT. I said, I think this is what I have. I think I have a brain tumor. He orders a brain scan. 2 days later, I'm on the 17th hole at Waterford Golf Course about to hit my second shot, and I get a phone call from the doctor, and he says, Mr. Hall, you were right. So I sent him a bill for my diagnosis. He never paid it, but hey, I'm still here. So shortly thereafter, I go to Emory, and they tell me it's a 10-hour operation. You have 2.3 centimeter brain tumors growing out of your auditory canal. 10-hour operation, 40% chance of paralysis, 5% chance you'll die in the operation. I said, no, thank you. So I go back to the internet and I find Dr. Jeffrey Williams at Johns Hopkins University, who was a pioneer in fractionated stereotactic radiation. And I emailed Dr. Williams and I said, can you radiate this tumor? Because I had been told in Atlanta they couldn't do it. He says, I do it every day. I said, sign me up. So I fly to Baltimore. They bolt my head on the table so they cook the tumor and not my brain. You should try it. It's a lot of fun. So they do this for 5 days. I go back home 3 weeks later. I go back to work. 20 years later, I've had 3 sick days in 20 years. So now my kids are 23 and 25, and when I was laying on that operating table, I was praying that I would stay alive and watch them grow up. And I've had the opportunity to do that. So I'm very grateful that I could do that. Now, why do I close with this story in reference to fraud? It's because fraud can be very silent, but very deadly. It can evolve very slowly, but become a very difficult and terrifying thing. So in your counties and your cities, I beg you to take the precautions that you can take to keep these kind of things from happening. I don't want you on some Monday morning to sit down and look at the front page of the paper and see a theft in your government. Do we have any other questions, Dan?
We do.
Okay.
So one, we have an answer to the standard question on this ACCG standard insurance for theft. And Ashley Abercrombie answers, the minimum employer dishonesty limits is $50,000 and the maximum is $500,000, but it really varies. If anyone wants to purchase higher limits, they can contact ACCG admin at marsh.com for a quote. Encourage them all that they can what they can do to prevent that. I also have a question here. When working with a constitutional officer, how can we ensure that they understand they must comply with the surprise audits? We have some that say that our CPA is not allowed to review their records, i.e., e.g., tax commissioner or sheriffs. Any recommendations to handle this?
Okay, I've actually run into this several times through the years. What I would say to you as a constitutional officer basically can do what they want to do. Now, they are subject to audit. So in the annual audit, your auditor should have the latitude to go in and audit any office. I've gotten some pushback in some sheriff's offices, basically like, don't go there. And that can be kind of trying for somebody like me doing the audit. But, like the county commissioners can't require the sheriff or the tax commissioner or probate court to do these, certain things like a surprise audit. If they can, I'm not aware of it, and I've been in the business about 35 years. That's always been a difficult thing in county governments. You've got these independently elected officials, and they'll say to you, one tax commissioner said to me, I report to the people, I don't report to you, talking to me as the auditor. So, I wish I could help you more in that regard, but until there's a discovery that theft has occurred, there's not a lot of latitude. In the tax commissioner example that I gave earlier, we detected that theft in year 1. It was year 3 before we were able to have that tax commissioner removed, and she went to jail. But until there's a problem there, it's really hard to get into that constitutional officer's office to do anything. Now, there's certain laws, like about, how often tax commissioners should remit their money. You could hold their feet to the fire on those kind of things, but again, they're largely independent. So it can be trying. I wish I could give you a better answer.
Very good. Well, we've went over our time, but I just want to say thank you for your discussion. I think it's hopefully prompted everybody to start thinking about this subject and to get people interested and start asking the questions. As always, if you have any questions or if you're concerned with threat, you can always give us a call to LGRMS or your associations, and we will do whatever we can to give you guys the expertise to investigate these opportunities, because we are seeing losses and we do need to do what we can to prevent these in the future. So whatever help you can assist us with, we appreciate it. Just being on this call is the first step. We will be happy to, again, answer any additional questions in the future. Thank you guys so very much, and have a great rest of the day.